Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And since today is, again, a slow news day, it's been a relatively slow news week, to be honest, for the last, like, 6, 7 days. But I wanted to talk about something that it's kind of a hypothetical situation. You know, I've heard this getting spouted around for many years now, that we're going to see a major crash in the film industry when the superhero genre runs out, basically. And it's kind of the idea of, the superhero genre will outstay its welcome, and eventually there will come a point where there will be almost like a hard wall, and superhero films will die out for a long period of time. Now, I've heard people have been saying that for probably the last 5 years. If you had talked to me a couple of years ago, I would have probably said, looking at the market right now, I think it's a load. I don't think it's possible right now. I don't foresee this happening in the near future. But now, since we've been seeing a lot more, it's been ramped up to such a point, I think it is very possible that we could see it, given what Marvel has been doing recently, as I've been covering in previous videos, and given the fact that DC is a little shaky here and there. They have been getting better, but given those things, could we see a major industry crash in the future? And I've also gone over some of the numbers for this year, and those numbers have continued to dip at about 2%, which is a slight decline. I haven't seen the international numbers to date. The first 6 months of the year, though, through June, it was down, I think, 2%, if I remember correctly. But as far as the box office numbers go for this year, for both domestic and international. So here's the thing. We've seen this before, or I shouldn't say we, but the film industry has seen this before with the Western. Now, for those people that aren't very familiar with older film, the Western was a main staple, almost the main staple, or actually it pretty much was the main staple of the film industry all the way from the 30s, and even a little before that too, even into the silent era, all the way up through the 1960s. And there were tons of westerns. A lot of really big movie stars were in westerns. You had obviously you had people like John Wayne. You had Clint Eastwood, who got his start in westerns and who was in some of the best ones ever, and including some of my favorite films, as well as John Wayne too. I think my top 10 film characters, I listed Ethan Edwards from The Searchers as one of my my 10th overall character. But actors like that. Robert Mitchum was in a few. You had James Caan, who was in some early on. Pretty much almost all actors, all really good actors that were around in the early era of film, in the the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Those actors a lot of the times at least were in one or two westerns because they were so huge. And a lot of directors literally made their bread and butter off of westerns, like John Ford, who directed John Wayne in a lot of his films, including The Searchers. But the thing is, the Western eventually died off. Audiences eventually got tired of it, and it was replaced in a lot of eras by science fiction and action films. Mostly, more so science fiction, I feel, from at least a film palette perspective. But you saw that drop off where you saw through the mid 70s, you still had westerns that were coming out, but they were getting fewer and fewer and fewer, and then eventually they just kind of dropped off completely by the 80s, and you almost didn't see any of them. And you still don't see a lot of them, even though there are a few that pop up here and there. I believe it was 1992 was when Unforgiven was released. I remember Christian Bale, and I can't remember, and Russell Crowe were in the remake of 310 to Yuma. Django from Quentin Tarantino, stuff like that. But for the most part, westerns are very scarce these days. And if you go back to the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they were fucking everywhere. And I feel like superhero films could see that route, where if you see it's again. I don't think it's going to be this hard wall that a lot of people have been talking about, where it's just going to drop off one day or one year, and you're going to see you're going to see movies making a good amount of money, and then the next year it's just going to tank horribly. I don't think you're going to see that type of a crash. You're not going to see just the whole superhero genre go off a cliff. I think you're going to see it slowly die out over time. But the difference being is that when westerns died out, there was a replacement for them. There were science fiction films and there were action movies that were coming out, and a lot of cop dramas and stuff became very popular in the 70s as well. You know, to quote another one, you know, you look at Clint Eastwood with the Dirty Harry movies. You know, even though a lot of people remember Clint Eastwood from his westerns, and personally, I actually prefer his westerns a little bit over some of his cop movies, except for maybe the first Dirty Harry and the second one. Um, you know, cop dramas kind of came in too. I believe John Wayne was also in one in the early to mid 70s, but you know, those kind of took over a little bit, and those were sort of like action movies and stuff like that. You know, again, those were things that were kind of, they weren't as common as westerns, but they kind of hung around a little bit. But really, when you look at it, you know, you have science fiction films. You know, you have big science fiction films. You look at Star Wars in the late 70s, Star Trek in the late 70s and early 80s. You know, 2001 and 1969 from Stanley Kubrick, that was a huge one. And various other ones that popped up along the way, in addition to also kind of fantasy films and stuff like that, which Star Wars kind of skirted the line with. But uh, when the superhero genre dies out, they don't have anything that I can see that's going to be able to replace it at the box office, and I think that is the major difference. Is there's no right now the studios are going to keep going with this and they're going to keep milking it, and the difference being is that back then they were willing to experiment with original ideas, and they were willing to put those original ideas on screen to see if they worked. Because here's the thing from a business perspective, and take everything I say with a grain of salt because I am not necessarily a businessman, but you know, I've seen through observation what tends to work and what doesn't. And here's the thing: when you're up, when you're making a lot of money, you can afford to take risks. You know, studios like Disney right now, or studios like you know, it's basically just Disney because they absorbed Fox, but you know, they can afford to take risks, but they're not going to for two reasons. Number one, they are lazy. And number two, they own I think the estimate right now is 30% of the film industry, which is insane. And on top of that, they also quote market themselves as a family-friendly film company or a production house, and that very much limits what you can produce because you know you can't produce a Die Hard at Disney, even though they're going to try and remake it, which again I think is a horrible idea. But limiting what you can produce based on what you think, what your kind of company is known for, and again, they can go through they can go through the various branches that they've acquired from Fox, like Fox Searchlight. That's been theorized in the future, but when you're up like that, when you're making money, you can afford to take risks on various things in the hopes that that thing can develop and you can make money off of that as well. And that's what they did in the 70s and into the 80s. Is you saw a lot of science fiction. Some of them became franchises, some of them not, but a lot of successful science fiction films and action movies coming out in those eras. You know, you had stuff like Blade Runner in 1982. You had Star Wars in 1977, along with its accompanying sequels. You had Indiana Jones. You know, it falls a bit more into the adventure category, but it's still kind of an action movie throughout the 80s. You know, you had a lot of that kind of stuff that was popping up, and you know, audiences ate it up because it was something that they hadn't seen before. It was something that they could absorb. You know, science fiction films in the 50s were, you know, big rubber monsters and stuff like that. You know, they hadn't seen anything really like a 2001 or like a Star Wars or like you know, a Star Trek or a Blade Runner, something like that. Those things hadn't been really shown before to audiences, and they ate it up, and that's why science fiction was able to carry the 80s and all the way into the 90s, along with horror in the 80s as well, because horror was huge then, which is now again a dead market for the most part. So you know, moving through that, you know, then you get into the 90s and stuff like that. Again, you still had the action movies, but they kind of died out. And then in the 2000s, that's when you started getting the superhero movies. And that's just developed more and more and more sense. Now, again, you did have superhero movies in the 70s and 80s, like the Superman films and Batman. But again, there doesn't appear to be a replacement, and there doesn't appear to be any studios that are willing to take risks in order to have a replacement. And that is where the real problem begins from a financial perspective, is that a lot of these studios, again, we see the trend of remakes and reboots and rehashes and all this kind of stuff. And ultimately, it stagnates the market because it's shit that people have already seen. And it leaves them creatively bankrupt, because once those things fail, and they inevitably will because they've been done better before, then you're left with nothing, because they're not willing to take risks. And ultimately, that is one of the primary tenets of business, is deciding whether or not to take a risk on something, because ultimately a majority of things are risks. Whether it's a high risk or a low risk is dependent, and whether or not it's a good payoff is dependent. But you have a chance to take risks, and you have a chance to do things that are new, and they are not doing that, and eventually that is going to come back and bite them in the ass. And I think that superhero films, when you go through the 2020s, I think they might go the way of the westerns. You're going to see a decline. I've already said this. You're going to see a decline with Marvel next year. Because you're just you're gonna have Eternals and Black Widow that are both gonna come out next year. I think you're gonna see a sharp drop off because of the slump after Endgame. And I think ultimately, if Marvel starts to decline, you're going to see declines in the DC films as well, and you're going to see the interest in the superhero genre wane, as it already is, because again, we're getting a lot of movies that are very similar. At least in tone and narrative, and they're not. It's just one after another, and a lot of them. Again, we people like to call it the Marvel formula, which is kind of the same idea, where you have the lighthearted jokiness combined with the good action and stuff like that. But eventually, people get tired of seeing the same thing over and over again, and you could see that with the slasher genre from the '80s, where they wore it to hell, and then by the time you got into the mid to late '90s, it was dead. You couldn't make a good slasher movie anymore. Pretty much after the mid '90s, there were a couple exceptions, like the Scream series, or at least the first one anyway. But for the most part, slasher movies had kind of run their course by then. And I think the same thing is going to happen to superhero films in the future if they continue down the path that they're on. If they don't try to innovate, if they don't try and mix things up a little bit, and if they don't try and produce things that are genre breaking. Because here's the thing, like I said before, the quote unquote Marvel formula. If you continue with that formula, it doesn't work like math. and here's the thing: is that it's kind of the idea of telling a joke over and over again. If you tell somebody a joke and they laugh, then you tell that same joke later on to the same person. Maybe they remember it, maybe they don't, maybe they'll laugh again. The third time, though, they're probably going to remember that you told the joke. Maybe you'll get a chuckle. And then by the fourth time, they'll just tell you to shut up because they've heard it 3 or 4 times before. So that's kind of where you're at now, where you're still getting the laughs out of the joke, but how many more times can you tell the joke before the person says, "Okay, I've heard enough. I'm done." And again, this is just something that again, you can see the trends in the market. You can see what happens over time with these films if originality isn't made. And like I said, the Western lasted for a very long time. It lasted for, over 40 years at the top for the American box office. And if you keep going, I don't think superhero films are going to last nearly that long at the rate that they're going. But, it's an interesting problem to kind of look at, and it's to kind of guess and see what's going to happen. But like I said, I think you will see a decline next year, and I think it might plateau for a little while. I don't think it's going to get any worse, maybe through 2021, 2022, but I think you will see a steady drop off going forward through the 2020s of all these film franchises, because audiences will get tired of it. But That's my opinion. I want to know yours. Do you think superhero films will go the way of the Western? Or do you think that there's enough innovation left in them that they can keep themselves going for another, 10, 15, 20 years, anything like that? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Again, I like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?